I recently went over what I call an evolved stretching method, which is a very fast, simple way to stretch most light curves within histograms to create an image with a good, adequate stretch that is suitable for editing and will preserve all the information. By itself, the evolved method works fine for most images, so long as the images have a flat luminosity. This means if the brightness throughout the image is relatively the same. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, of course, but relatively the same. But some DSOs, such as galaxies in particular, or the Orion Nebula or Iris Nebula as other examples, will have specific regions that are much brighter than the other regions. And some images will have 2, 3, or more diverse ranges of brightness. When one encounters such images, one is faced with a very specific conundrum. Do you stretch the histogram for the dimmer areas, the mid-range brightness, the brighter areas? If the image has many ranges of brightness such as the Orion Nebula, which do you favor? The advanced evolved stretching method is a way to cope with this. In it, one divides the image into its ranges of brightness and stretches the images to maximize the detail within those ranges. To illustrate how to cope with widely varied ranges of brightness, I'm going to use a target that I think many of us, at least those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, have shot, the Whirlpool Galaxy, which is really two galaxies in the process of interacting, making it a very dramatic and unusual DSO that shows up well, even in telescopes of relatively low focal length. This image has regions of low brightness, mid brightness, and the core, which is so bright it must be thought of as a range unto itself. Let's begin by stretching the RGB information of the whirlpool for the core. I've already stacked the information and run the blur exterminator on it in correct and default mode to ensure the stars are rounded, deconvolved, and the detail is sharpened adequately. And as you can see, I've already removed the stars. The RGB information in front of you has not yet been stretched though. You are able to see it because I have used the screen transfer function to slap a temporary working stretch on the information so that we can work with it. So what I'm going to do is do a histogram stretch for the core. I'll start by dragging the image tab into the view window to show the RGB information's histogram. Open a preview window. I'll remove the temporary STF stretch and scroll the vertical view box to 20, which will help me to see the base of the stretch and the light curve. The vertical view box is here, right within the circle. Then I'm going to go to the right of the light curve box and drag the scroll bar down so that I can see the base of the light curve. And then I'm going to move the midpoint icon right here, roughly to the right of the light curve to make it visible. Then I'll move the black point icon right here, roughly to the left of the beginning of the light curve, to establish some definition within the image. As I work, I'll use the horizontal zoom box to scroll in more and more on the light curve so that I can do finer and finer work. What I want to do is establish a black point that is just dark enough to differentiate the subtle shades of darker gases and brighter stars within the core of the Whirlpool Galaxy. And I want to move the midpoint icon up just bright enough to adequately illuminate the core without it becoming so bright that we lose sight of the detail. The process is a bit subjective, so you'll have to use your eyes to make good judgment. To really get the very best structure in the core, it can help to zoom in a bit to give a more precise view. The preview window in PixInsight has an unusual zoom feature. You have to click on this little box in the upper left, and then click and drag a view box over your subject of interest. However, having done so, I can see that I just about have the detail and the brightness that I am looking for. However, I can further enhance the detail within the core by raising the black point just a bit. I'm going to put the black point just within the blue and green channels inside the light curve. Unlike with the evolve stretch, I'm not going for a fixed point here, but rather just looking for that point that seems to define the detail the best within just the core and the brightest areas. So in this galaxy, there are actually two cores. There's the galaxy of the Whirlpool itself and its companion galaxy toward the bottom of the image. The middle icon stretches the curve, which increases the brightness, and I'm going to keep moving that closer to the light curve, increasing the brightness until I begin to lose sight of the definition within the core of the galaxy. And at that point, I'm going to stop, apply the stretch to the image, run the noise exterminator, and save it as a lossless TIFF named RGB Core. Now I'm going to perform the more typical evolve stretch on the same image, thereby increasing its brightness to bring out the arms, the nebulous gases within, the dark gases within, and the haze, which is really a haze made of stars, all along the southern outer regions of this galaxy, which is being created by the tidal forces of gravity tearing up that other galaxy. Now in this stretch, the goal is to get the most out of the arms and the outer regions of the galaxy. It will lead to the cores being blown out, but we'll fix that with our core stretch later. So, having saved the previous stretch as RGB core, I'm going to undo the stretches that I made within that image. And without the screen transfer function temporary stretch in the image, this brings us back to a black screen. I don't need to reset the histogram stretching tool, however. I can just pick up where I left off and move the middle icon to the innermost channel of the light curve, where the right side of the inner channel light curve touches the first bar of the histogram. And I'll place the left icon, which establishes the black point, at the innermost channel on the left side, situating it so that if a vertical line were drawn up from the triangle, the vertical line would intersect the light curve halfway between the base and the first bar of the light curve, right there. Now I'll finish setting the midpoint icon, which establishes the brightness, where the innermost channel of the light curve intersects the first bar of the histogram, right there. Now I'll just close the preview window and apply this stretch to the image, run the noise exterminator, and save the RGB image as a lossless TIFF, just like the RGB core. And I'll name this one RGB LF structure for RGB linear fit structure, meaning this image will show the structure of the two galaxies. I'm just going to pause here for a moment and point out the two satellite scars to the right of the galaxy and the one fainter satellite scar to the left of the galaxy. Don't ever let anybody tell you that you can ignore those things and go ahead and stack them in your images. I know many persons say that stacking sorts it out. Stacking might sort it out if you have lots and lots of images, because the stacking software doesn't know what you look at. It doesn't know that the subject is the galaxy. It just measures the statistics of the information and decides what's going to be there based on that. So if you have lots and lots of good subs, it may well eliminate satellite scars, but even then sometimes not. If the satellite scars are quite bright or broad, or if you get a falling star in the image for the same reason, if it's bright or broad, it might overlook it. And sometimes even if they're faint and you have hundreds of subs, it still might overlook it. I always find that the best and safest course of action is just to manually preview all the images, check for satellite scars, and any image that has a satellite tracing through an area of interest, I just discard that image. I'd rather discard the image than put bad data into a stack. It takes a long time to stack data, it's just easier to get the junk out to begin with. I'll take these scars out later on when I get to my layer-based photo editor, Affinity Photo, using the in-painting tool. It's not terribly difficult, but the final stack would have been altogether better if I had removed the subs with the satellite scars to begin with. Now I'm going to use the exact same advanced evolve stretching strategy on the L channel. I'm not going to show that process because it really is just a repeat of what you just saw. The only difference is being it's luminance data. There aren't any color channels to worry about working with, which actually makes it simpler to operate on. Just take note that you might choose to do things differently, but I do not put the luminance information together with the RGB information in PixInsight, because to customize how they are composited together, you have to mess endlessly with pixel math. Whereas you can composite images together quickly, visually, and easily using a layer-based photo editor. So I just add the L to the RGB in Affinity Photo, where I can visually select from many composite options and easily preview which will best fit the image and situation. And that's really necessary in the case of an image where you're dealing with varying areas of very different brightness, because some composite methods will blend that information together fairly smoothly and other composite methods will not. And one final side note before we carry on. If you use RC Astro's Noise Exterminator, it's best practice to run the Noise Exterminator on your images after you conduct a stretch. However, if you're working with an image that has a very bright region and is barely stretched at all, you may find the Noise Exterminator creates artifacts, in which case, just skip it. Let's move on over to Affinity Photo. Here are the 4 images I created from the previous stretches, the RGB and L core and the RGB and L structure. We'll start by working on the brightest region and begin with the RGB structure. It's best if you begin with your RGB image. Luminance is more easily added to RGB information than the other way around, and dragging in the RGB image first establishes your color space within Affinity Photo. So we'll begin by dragging in the RGB LF structure plate, and then the luminance structure plate. The snap tool, upper middle right, is already activated, so I can select the arrow tool and then just drag the luminance plate directly into place over the RGB plate and they will snap together, perfectly aligning. Then I'll name the RGB plate and duplicate it so it can serve as a base, a sort of beginning place to work from should I need to back up the editing process. Then I'll make the original layer invisible and leave it locked so it's not accidentally altered. Now I'm going to zip through Affinity Photo's 38 various composite modes and find the one that seems to work the best. For combining brighter luminance to RGB plates, luminosity is usually the composite mode of choice. However, some of this information was shot under bright moonlight conditions, and the luminosity composite mode leaves a lot of that residual color in the space. Soft light mode more strongly emphasizes the difference between brights and darker regions, and nicely buries much of that unwanted background. It also shows up the detail within the galaxy very well because of its knack for emphasizing subtle structure. So in this unusual case, I'm going to go with the soft light composite mode, and this is why I choose to composite luminance channels to RGB information in a layer-based photo editor rather than PixInsight. If you composite with PixInsight, it's essentially just going to use the luminosity composite mode, which most of the time works great. It adds brightness to brightness and respects darker regions, but there are some exceptions, such as this one. Now there is some residual red in the space. It's easy enough to remove it using a levels tool, but in the course of removing it, I don't want to affect the high frequency information where the detail is. So I am using the frequency separation tool to tear apart the RGB structure layer into its low and high frequency components. I'll quickly label those new high and low frequency layers to show that they relate to the RGB structural information. And now I'll quickly extract that unwanted red background before moving on. In the RGB low frequency layer, which is where the color light information will be, I'll open a levels tool, switch to the red channel, and drive the black level up a percent or two, which will constrict red to appearance in somewhat brighter areas, effectively removing the red from the dark space. And I'll enhance the change by sliding up the gamma just a little bit, just somewhat refining the constriction. I made a few other touch-ups as well, but this video isn't really about manual background extraction and color balancing, so I'm going to skip over that, and let's go ahead and move on to integrating the luminance and RGB core layers to the image. Once again, I'll just open the Windows Explorer and begin by dragging in the RGB core layer. Then I'll drag the luminance core or L core layer over it. In Affinity Photo, I'll switch to the arrow icon and use it to drag the L and RGB core layers directly over the structure layers. With the snap tool activated, the new layers will snap quickly and easily perfectly into place. Now at this moment, the composite mode of each of the new core layers is set for normal, meaning they are opaque, they cannot be seen through. I'll select the L layer and experiment with composite modes till I find the one that best adds the core layer's L information to the core layer's RGB information. Light here is darker, and the transitions between light and shadow are more delicate. So this will take a bit longer since I'll have to be a bit more selective in finding the best composite mode. In the end, the luminosity composite mode appears to do the best job. The next step is I'm going to frequency separate the information from the RGB core layer, and this will allow me to very specifically adjust the color and brightness in the low frequency layer without having to worry about how those adjustments will affect the high frequency information where the detail is, meaning I can push the color and brightness harder without the risk of devolving detail into grittiness. First though, always remember to name your new layers. Believe me, when working in a layer-based photo editor, you can quickly accumulate a lot of layers of editing, and it is remarkably easy to forget what's what if you don't label them. With the RGB core high and low frequency layers labeled, I'll open a levels tool in the low frequency information and begin making adjustments to its brightness and colors. The goal is to increase the brightness and colors of the galaxy and its associated gaseous regions, which aren't really gas, it's thickets of stars that are too far away and too dense at that distance for the telescope to resolve individually. And at the same time, I'm also going to constrict that reddish background in the same way that I constricted the red just a moment ago, by increasing the black level a percent or two and slightly constricting the gamma. When that's done, I'll begin synergistic sharpening in the RGB high frequency information, which starts with an unsharp mask opened in the high frequency layer, and the radius slider slid up until the layer begins to devolve into grittiness. Once it begins to devolve, I'll back it off just a little bit and see if I can make any further progress with the factor slider. By separating out the high-frequency information, you can push its sharpness further than you could if the high-frequency information remained combined with the low-frequency information. Doing so allows you to specifically sharpen detail without affecting the underlying brightness and color information. The strategy behind synergistic sharpening is, once done with the unsharp mask, open a clarity tool in the same high-frequency layer, place it above the unsharp mask so it adds its effects to the unsharp mask, push it as far as you can, and then open the high-pass filter and place it above the clarity tool. That way, each tool is synergistically adding its sharpening algorithm to the previous tool. There are getting to be a lot of layers in this image, so I'm going to group together all the structure layers and their associated tools, just to get them out the way and simplify the work area. Also, by having them as a group, I can turn them all on and off with a single click on the group layer. Then I'm going to frequency separate the L core layer, label those as L core low frequency and L core high frequency, and apply the same light enhancements and sharpening operations to those layers. This will begin by setting the composite mode of the low frequency information L core layer so that it adds its information to the RGB core layer below it. Luminosity appears to do the best job. And with that done, I'm going to apply synergistic sharpening to the high frequency information of the L core layer. This is handled in the exact same way that synergistic sharpening was applied to the previous high frequency layers. When that's done, I'm going to merge the core layers and their associated tools into a new pixel layer. This is very simple. With only the core layers and their editing tools visible, I'll right-click on one of those layers and select Merge Visible, and that will yield a new pixel layer with all the combined information. This I'll label LRGB Core. Then I'll take all the discrete core layers and merge them into a single group, label the group and make it invisible. It's not likely to be needed anymore. Now we have a unified LRGB core layer that we can work with. I'm then going to make everything invisible except for the structure group. Right-click on it and select Merge Visible, thereby making a new pixel layer with all the structure information combined, and I'll label it LRGB Structure. This will get moved to beneath the LRGB core group. The structure group, like the core group, will also be made invisible. This greatly simplifies things because now we just have two layers to operate on, LRGB core and LRGB structure, and each of those new pixel layers has all the combined information from our editing operations. With that done, we can at last begin merging the dark core information with the bright structure information, a process which will preserve the core detail while maximizing the much dimmer outer information. This will begin by changing the composite mode of the new LRGB core layer, with the goal being to find the composite mode that will add its information best to the brighter LRGB structure layer. In the end, the lightened composite mode does the best job. It gently adds the core light information to the structure information while respecting the dark areas. However, it still leaves the core of both the Whirlpool galaxy and the interacting galaxy somewhat blown out. I need to darken the luminosity without losing the high frequency information where the detail is kept. So I'll deal with this by frequency separating our new LRGB structure layer. And of course, each layer will promptly be relabeled. Now if you remember, the low frequency information is where we find our brightness information, and that's where the light that's blowing out the core is, so I'll just erase that out. I could do this in three ways. I could use the erase tool to just erase out the layer itself, but if I decide I want to add some of that information back later, it would be very difficult. The only option is to undo the erasure. I could open a mask tool in the layer, which would block the entire layer out, invert the mask tool, and then use the paintbrush tool to paint out the unwanted brightness. But my favorite way to mask out unwanted information is to open the curves tool, set it for alpha, and drag the alpha curve all the way to 0, which makes the layer invisible. Then I can invert the curves tool, using it like a mask tool, so that it blocks nothing, and then use the paintbrush tool set for white to paint back in just enough of the mask to block out the excessive light from the core of the structure layer. And I'll also paint out the excessive light from the core of the interacting galaxy. This is more flexible than simply using a mask, which is an all or nothing tool. By using the curves tool as a mask, I can later lift the alpha curve, reducing its masking effect by however little or much that I want. I'll use the same technique to erase out most of the high frequency information from the core of the structure layer too, because the high frequency information there has been completely blown out by the intense light of the core. So there's little detail in the high frequency information from the structure layer. Getting both the low and high frequency information out from the core of the structure layer allows the core information from the dark layer to show through much better. You may be wondering why, if I was going to go ahead and remove both the low and high frequency information from the bright core of the structure layer, why did I bother to separate the layers first? Why not just remove it all together? Elementary, Watson. Each of those layers does contribute a little bit to the image, though the high frequency layer probably contributes a little bit more. So by separating them, I could very specifically adjust just how much information was removed from the low and high frequency layers of the structure layer. When the blown out core from the low and high frequency layers of the structure layer are removed, and the darker but much more detailed information is revealed from the core layer, it is then time to balance the brightness between the two sets of information. I don't want to affect the delicate detail within the high frequency information from the core layer, so I'll begin by frequency separating the core layer, labeling the low and high frequency core layers as LRGB core LF and LRGB core HF, and then I'll change the composite mode of the core low frequency layer to lighten. This will cause it to add all of its light information gently to the structure layers below. Upon doing this, however, I see that I need to remove yet a bit more information from the interacting galaxy's core. But first, I'm going to finish balancing the brightness of the core of the Whirlpool galaxy with the rest of the galaxy. I'll begin by adding a brightness tool to the core low frequency layer. Then, I'll slowly turn up the brightness until the center of the Whirlpool galaxy matches brightness with the rest of the Whirlpool structure. Now I'm going to go to the structure layer's low frequency information and operate on the curves tool that I'm already using for a mask there, and mask out the excessive brightness from the interacting galaxy. With the curves layer selected, I'll select the paintbrush tool, and with it set for mask, select the white color, which will tell the paintbrush tool to paint back in the mask. Then I'll paint in the mask, effectively painting out the luminosity from the structure layer over the interacting galaxy's core. This leaves all the high frequency information from both the structure and core layer information, maximizing the sharpness and detail to be found in that area. And this gives us our final result, a Whirlpool galaxy and its interacting companion galaxy, with all their structure revealed from the darkest outer regions to the core. By creating two separate stretches, one for the bright core regions and one for the rest of the galaxy, it was possible to reveal all the detail within these amazing structures, without risk of losing the dim information to being crushed by the blacks, or blowing out the bright information in the two cores. Some structures have even more complex brightness. They may have regions that are very bright, regions of upper brightness, regions of moderate brightness, and two or more regions of low brightness. And by using multiple stretches to handle each of those regions, you can keep all of that information and incorporate it all smoothly into a composite image comprised of many different histogram stretches. Thank you for watching. If you have any observations or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something, I sure would appreciate it if you took a moment to hit those like and subscribe buttons. I hope this helps you to improve your astrophotography and ultimately to have more fun in the craft. Now, get out there and shoot the sky.